All right, so for starting with general permits, hope everybody's doing good. We went through all the questions, so let's move on. All right, general permits, or GPs, are permitted activities authorized by the department for trimming that does not meet the criteria laid out in the exemption section. There are two types of GPs. There is a GP for a view, which is your standard height reduction trimming, and there is a navigation GP, which is for the trimming of waterways for navigational access. Notice to use either GP must be provided to the department in the form of an application. The application fee for the GP is $250, and each has its own criteria. So first, let's go through the GP for review. All right, so the GP for review, here is the outline and diagram for the criteria for the first general permit in the Act. The GP for review is allotted for riparian property owners who want to trim mangroves on their property or on sovereign submerged lands immediately waterward and perpendicular to their property. First, the trimming must be conducted exclusively or by a PMT, either supervised or on-site. Mangroves to be trimmed under this GP may not extend more than 500 feet from the shoreline. Like with the exemptions, this is measured from the most landward trunk to the most waterward trunk in a line perpendicular to the shoreline. No more than 65% of the applicable mangroves may be trimmed. Note that applicable mangroves means mangroves that could legally be trimmed under the GP. This means only 65% of the mangroves that are growing along the shoreline, which exceed 6 feet in height, and do not extend more than 500 feet waterward. The diagram on the right shows mangroves that qualify for trimming under the GP in the dark green. It also shows mangroves that do not qualify because they are not growing along the shoreline, which is depicted in the light green, or that they extend beyond 500 feet waterward, which is the hatched section. So in this example, if this was someone's property, the owner could only trim 65% of the dark green area under this GP. Okay, so I'm going to go through this diagram step by step to explain why it is colored the way it is and what doesn't qualify and why. So first, the area in the red circle is marked as does not qualify for the GP. This is because these mangroves, this is because these mangroves are not growing along the shoreline. There is a patch of marsh growing in between the mangroves and the shoreline, so these mangroves may not be trimmed under the GP. And they also cannot count towards the 35% no trim area because they are not applicable mangroves under the GP. Here I have highlighted a few mangrove islands. Even though they are within 500 feet of the shoreline, they are not growing along the shoreline, and it is also the intent of the legislature that no trimming will occur on uninhabited mangrove islands. These will also not count towards the 35% no trim area for the GP. These two sections are adjacent to an area where mangroves can be trimmed under a GP, so why can't these? Well, the left arrow is pointing to an area that is cut off from the property shoreline by a body of water, and therefore these mangroves are not growing along the shoreline. The area that the right arrow is pointing to is separated from the rest of the mangrove fringe by a marsh system, and therefore are also not growing along the shoreline. And since these two areas do not qualify to be trimmed under the GP, they also cannot be used in the 35% no trim area. The last arrow points to the crosshatch section where the mangroves extend beyond 500 feet from the shoreline, and therefore the entire swath of mangroves does not qualify to be trimmed under the GP. Note that if you have any mangroves that extend beyond 500 feet, you may not trim the fringe up to the 500-foot mark and then stop, leaving what extends beyond 500 feet untrimmed. If any part of the continuous fringe extends beyond 500 feet, then all of those mangroves in a line perpendicular to the shoreline, starting from the shoreline, do not qualify and are kicked out of the GP. An individual alteration permit would be required to trim the mangroves in this diagram that do not qualify to be trimmed under the GP. So I just covered the criteria needed to use a GP. Now I have a few slides to show how a GP cannot be used. In this example here, is to demonstrate that a GP cannot be layered with an exemption in order to make 100% of the shoreline trimmable. Here we have a fringe where some of the mangroves are over 20 feet tall, which cannot be trimmed under the exemption. So the homeowner wants to place a GP on the parcel so they can trim the mangroves over 24 feet in height. And then once all of the mangroves are under 24 feet tall, the homeowner wants to claim that they can trim 100% of the fringe under the exemption. This is not the case. Once a GP is placed on a parcel, it is locked into that configuration. And since a GP has a 35% no trim area, the homeowner would not be able to trim 100% of the shoreline unless they received an alteration permit. So you have 65% trim and 35% no trim. You cannot use an exemption in an area already deemed a no trim area under a GP. So again, not applicable. In the same fashion, you cannot layer two of the same types of GPs. For example, two GPs for a view to trim 100% of your shoreline. Here the homeowner receives a GP 001 to trim 65% of the mangroves in the hatched area and leave 35% no trim area. Once they have reached the final configuration of the GP, they then want to apply for another GP on the parcel and this time have the 65% trim area cover the previous 35% no trim area. This is not permissible. For purposes of general permits, once a parcel has a GP configuration for height, area, etc., and trimming is performed under that GP, the parcel is locked into that configuration. Okay, so let's move on to the navigation GP. The navigation general permit allows for riparian property owners to trim mangroves that overhang into navigable waters in order to maintain access through those waters. The trimming is restricted to only mangrove branches or trunks that extend into the channel beyond the most waterward root or root system. This picture shows an extreme example where a red mangrove proproot has extended far into the waterway. Under this GP, trimming may only occur to the right of the vertical red line, which is inside the channel. Any trimming to the left of the red line or trimming of any roots would not be permissible and may result in a violation. Here's a diagram version of the real-life example, this time with overhanging branches. Again, you draw a vertical plane at the most waterward root. Any branch or trunk overhang beyond that plane may be trimmed. Just like with all other exempt and permitted trimming projects, no mangrove roots shall be cut or trimmed under navigation GPs. Now, I stated earlier that you cannot layer multiple view GPs or a GP and exemption in order to trim more of your shoreline. However, the Act does allow for up to one of each type of GP on the same parcel. So for example, a riparian property owner with navigation access can have a GP for a view and a navigation GP on the same parcel, and the two can even overlap. Now, the same criteria still apply to the GPs, which means that no more than 25% of the foliage of any mangrove can be removed annually from the two permits combined. This may mean that you trim more from one GP than the other, or you may have to alternate trimming years. The homeowner has to decide which of the two is more important for their parcel, either the navigation trim or the height reduction. As part of the legislative intent, trimming conducted on properties with multifamily residences, for example, condo complexes, etc., must have an equitable distribution of view. This means that for the view GP, the 65% trim area must be equally distributed across the property so all residents have a similar view. In this diagram, the trim areas are generally directly between the buildings and the water in order to provide the best view of the water for the residents. The no trim areas are between the buildings. This helps to satisfy the percent trim requirement, the equitable distribution requirement, and provide a view. Note that the trim configuration must not allow for more than 65% of the qualifying mangroves to be trimmed. And this is just one type of configuration for the parcel. Any configuration proposed may be used so long as it meets the necessary criteria. Okay, so to summarize the GP for a view, first we covered the trimming must be conducted exclusively by a PMT. The mangroves subject to trimming do not extend more than 500 feet waterward from the shoreline. No more than 65% of the applicable mangroves may be trimmed, and we went through how to determine if the mangroves are applicable or not. No mangroves may be trimmed below 6 feet in height. No herbicide or other chemicals will be used for trimming. A GP may be used only once to achieve a height of no less than 6 feet. Trimming must be conducted in stages so that no more than 25% of the foliage is removed annually. And lastly, the final configuration of the view GP is exempt to be maintained under 403-93261D so long as no defoliation occurs, which means that homeowners are exempt to maintain their final configuration so long as they do not trim more than what was allotted by the GP and they do not defoliate the mangroves. A PMT or others can also maintain the configuration if the homeowner prefers. And for a summary of the navigation GP, the bullets in red are overlap from the GP for review. So the only additional stipulation is that under the nav GP, the trimming is limited to mangrove branches and trunks that extend into the navigational channel beyond a vertical plane of the most waterward prop root or root system.